Yo, welcome back to Real Talk. I'm your host, ANAKINSKY. Hey, yo, I got a simple question, dog. Has anybody ever went on Google and typed in, there is no law for freedom of thought? That shit will blow your mind, kid. Think about this for a minute. If there's no law for freedom of thought, then how do people got freedom? Because last I checked, the first thing that people would think about having freedom is freedom to use their own mind, right? So how is it the American government has a law, has stated that there is no law for freedom of thought? This freedom of speech, but speech and thought is different things. If I sit back and say that I think that it's wrong for people to have slavery instead of freedom, the government says no, there's no law for freedom of thought. You can speak only what the American government is programmed. So if the American government says that this is the greatest place on earth and you say that, they don't have a problem. But if you sit back and say the American government allows slavery because slavery is still legal due to the 13th Amendment, that's why the police department harass melanated people, because the system has to pay so many people, and so forth, meaning the wardens of all the jails, money for every empty cell. But as long as that cell is full of people, the tax money pays the daggone government that pays the daggone warden. But as soon as motherfucking people get locked up, that means the government ain't got no money to pay the warden. But if people is not in jail, then the daggone government has to pay the warden. That would mean, and so forth, simply that the American government uses the police department to harass melanated people, so that melanated people fill those jails, so that the government can make money off of the slaves. This is the reason why most melanated people have jail records in some shape, some fashion, because the American government wants melanated people in jail from all varieties, so that the government does not have to freaking help people in the jail. That's why there's more melanated people in jail. So when they talk about how the census says how many people live in America, well, they can't count the people that's in the jail cell, right? So if a majority of melanated people is in jail, then that census is inaccurate, especially when you start realizing that the federal government tells people that just because they're still melanated people that is not European, they can say that it is, just so the American government can make the number of people that's locked up and the people that have themselves in a position where they're not in jail have more equivalencies of pale people, knowing they're not pale people. Because last I checked and so forth, people that come from Afghanistan ain't white people. But yet people from Afghanistan can sit back and say that they is white, yet still get treated like a melanated person, but the census will sit back and say that they're not, even though logistically they still is a demographic of melanated people. But people don't know that, and people sit back and say, well, what about the people that's from the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, and movement and ISIS? When people think about the people from Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and all that type of stuff, these are melanated people. They just have to be light-skinned melanated people. But they get labeled as white, losing that identity of who they really was in the process, and still get harassed by the police in the same philosophy. Doesn't that mean the American government is running a scam? That's exactly what that means, right? So how does the federal government sit back and say so forth that the amount of people that's melanated is less, when in actuality they don't even actually sit back and say the proper demographic of melanated people that's actually in America in the first place, whether they from a different landmass like Iraq or they're in jail. That means the American government is scamming this shit out of everybody. But as soon as somebody say that, that's a thought. And there's no law for freedom of thought. So you're not supposed to even think that the American government is running a scam. Because as soon as you sit back and say that, the federal government sit back and say, No, melanated person, don't ever sit back and say the government is manipulating the fuck out of everybody, because the American government dictated a plan saying it stayed in slavery, and as a slave owner, they can say what the hell they want to say. And don't think that because you're a slave that you deserve to have freedom in this land, man, because America is not geared for slaves to have freedom. That's why people are known as minorities in the first place, fool. And I sit back and say, that's disrespectful and wrong as a mug. But yet the federal government sit back and say, no, 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 it's good for you. This is America, land of the slaves. You know what I'm saying? But that's a thought. And as soon as somebody sit back and say and so forth, that people need freedom, the American government says, that's terrorism. So let me get this straight. Let's say a black man, or any other nationality for that matter, was to sit back and say, Black lives matter, Hispanic lives matter, Native Indigenous lives matter, Shemitic lives matter, Asiatic lives matter. Every demographic of melanated life matters. Equally as one. The federal government say, he's a terrorist, she's a terrorist, that person's a terrorist, that person's a terrorist. They're all terrorists. That's what Trump would say, they're all terrorists, right? So that would mean and so forth. When people sit back and look at people from the Middle East that's not part of Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS movement regime, and the Taliban and all that stuff, they just happen to live in the same desert sands. And they're not part of that stuff. Because the fact they came from there, American government associates them with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS movement regime, the Taliban, and all that stuff, right? And they're not even part of that. But they sit back and say, no, they got to be a terrorist because they come from the same desert sands. Well, newsflash, Adam and Eve lived in Iraq as well, ancient Mesopotamia. Don't believe me? Google search that joint. That would mean and so forth if all melanated people started from Adam and Eve, right? That would mean and so forth if all demographics of people started from Adam and Eve, that every single person is a terrorist. But you're not supposed to think that's very highly immoral, right? But that's what I'm talking about. There's no freedom of thought. Ain't no one supposed to ever think about, you know what, the American government is like wrong for real. But no. Don't think about freedom. Because as soon as you think about freedom, the American government says, hey, melanated person, come here. Do you want freedom in America? America's not designed for melanated people to have freedom. Stay in jail, aka slavery, aka oppression, aka police brutality, aka jail cells, aka motherfucking media manipulation, aka miseducation in the school system, aka Democrat and Republican, aka Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi, Aryan, Freemason, Ashkenazi, German administration philosophy of oppression. But one thing you're not supposed to do is think you're supposed to have freedom, not in America. You see what I'm saying? But as soon as we sit back and say, hey, that's racist and not fair. No, Negro. That's good for you. Stay in freaking oppression. That's the American way. Wowzers. But what about the land of Azathoth? People talk about some make America great again. What about Azathoth? Knowing that's the real name of this land in the first place, it was America as well. America Potter as well. Which got nothing to do with the name America. And if people are like, what the frick is Azathoth? Oh, you don't know what Azathoth is? Oh, well, Azathoth is what you consider as Canada. That's part of Azathoth. What you consider as North America, it's part of Azathoth. What you consider as South America, it's part of Azathoth. What you consider as Cuba, where I used to live, it's part of Azathoth. What you consider as Mashima or Mexico, it's part of Azathoth. What you consider as Jamaica, it's part of Azathoth. What you consider as Brazil, it's part of Azathoth. What you consider as Bahamas, it's part of Azathoth. What you consider as Hawaii, it's part of Azathoth. What you consider that? What you consider as the Cayman Islands, it's part of Azathoth. Pretty much every single place of the Western Hemisphere is part of Azathoth. But yet that landmass of Azathoth has now got so many different names because Europeans decided to sit back and say stuff. But no one put to sit back and say, hey, before Christopher Columbus, all this was Azathoth. And everything on the Eastern Hemisphere is all Asian. They be like, how you figure everything on the East? What is Asia? Oh, you don't know? Every single person that was in Azra started out in Asia. Asia is what you consider as China. That's part of Asia. Japan, that's part of Asia. Vietnam, that's part of Asia. Russia, that's part of Asia. Africa, north, east, west, and south, is part of Asia. Israel is part of Asia. Iraq is part of Asia. Pretty much everything in the Eastern Hemisphere is part of Asia. Now, that being said, there was people say, what about Pangea and Gaia and how the Grecians used to call it Gi? Well, before all that, it was known as Adama. How do you know that? Adam was the first man. Most people don't even know the name of the planet they live on. The word Adam means man. The word Adama means soil or dirt. Adam was made from the dirt, the desert sands. God in Christ made Adam from the desert sands in Iraq, the cradle of civilization. So if Adam and Eve were the first people on the planet, the desert sands in Iraq as black and brown, we know that Adam and Eve must have been as well, just like God in Christ, right? We said that before. That means essentially and so forth, fake. Why is it the people that started every society is in oppression globally? And people think there's some freedom? We was the Moroccans. We also is the Hebrew Israelites. We also was known as what's called Aramaic as well. You know, say we also nowadays we know as Negro, or some people say African American. We ain't really African. African is a French government philosophy, but that's a whole other story. We'll say that for another day. But then well, we're known as black or brown or Nate or Amarucan. I mean, we're named by a whole different label, different labels of things. But really, we just Hebrew Israelites for real. You know what I'm saying? But the thing about it is, when people look at Australia, the roots of Australia started in Asia, specifically the desert sands in Iraq. Everything, there's not one place that does not link to the desert sands in Iraq. But how you figure that? I name a place on the earth or Adama that does not use a wheel. Nowhere, right? Where was the wheel invented? It was invented in Mesopotamia, which is ancient Iraq. So since the wheel itself was invented in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, then everyone in the world uses the wheel, right? They mean everyone's ancestors started out in Iraq. People use languages, right? Every language links to the Hebrew and Aramaic language with the first languages, right? So that means that every single person that speaks any language speaks languages that was invented by people that started out in the desert sands of Iraq that fast. We're gonna sit back and break that shit down. So everybody links back to Mesopotamia. So when people sit back and say, this is America, question, why they using English? A language that was stolen. Because originally white people were speaking Russian. So why would they steal a language and force everybody in the world to say the same language? Slavery everywhere, English everywhere. Same philosophy. There's English everywhere means everyone must speak the name of the world that was stolen and then spoken in English. Because it was Adama. But yet no one supposed to remember that. Because the end result was everybody says earth because that's what they slave owner told them. But that's a thought, right? But in America, there's no direct law for freedom of thought. Now I would say think about it, because technically that's illegal for somebody to think, but that means every single person breaks the law every day because the American government says no one's supposed to think. But think about that. Everyone thinks. If I'm breaking the law by thinking, then the same person that's watching this video at this exact moment, when you think about how that's not fair, how the American government says no one's supposed to think, you're breaking the law right now, technically. Because there's no law for freedom of thought. That's how much we know we're in slavery, fam. I hope y'all enjoyed that. This been Real Talk. I'm your host, AKINSKY. Real Talk. Free your mind. Free the people, y'all.